There was always going to be a comparison between the ASUS ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. Of course there was. Two handhelds, both offering a PC-style experience, both at a competitive price point. In one corner you've got the tried and tested Linux handheld that's had over a full year head start, and in the other, the scrappy newcomer boasting about knockout power with a selection of hardware problems. The Steam Deck and the ASUS ROG Ally aren't so much apples and oranges as they are apples and apples. Where am I going with this? My point is both handhelds are exceptional at what they do. But going back to the Steam Deck after spending so much time with the ASUS ROG Ally feels like a visual downgrade. The Ally isn't perfect by any means and the annoyances are plenty, but when it comes to gaming, the ASUS ROG Ally is the first handheld that makes you want to stop playing with your deck. When it comes to power, there's a lot of tech speak. I won't confuse you with everything, don't worry. To keep things simple, let's focus on the four areas that matter. The ASUS ROG Ally packs in the AMD Ryzen Z1 Extreme for the CPU, integrated AMD Radeon graphics, a 512GB M.2 SSD, and for the screen you've got a 1920x1080p IPS display that runs at 120Hz. In simple terms, what this means is you've got a massive amount of power that ASUS says doubles that of the Steam Deck. How true is that claim? It all depends on the game. Cyberpunk 2077 on the Steam Deck is best played at 30 frames per second. On the ROG Ally, it can't hit a solid and smooth 60 frames per second, but it can offer sharper and more vibrant visuals alongside a higher and more stable frame rate. Double the power may be oversimplifying things. In some cases, that's completely accurate. In others, the double isn't as simple as 30 frames becoming 60. You've got to look for it. On the whole though, I can understand what ASUS is getting at. It's not always obvious at first glance, but dig in and play around with the different settings and you'll start to understand how and why the ASUS ROG Ally is that much more powerful. Visually, the ROG Ally breaks boundaries in the handheld space. The colours pop, crispness revitalises games, and the CPU and integrated graphics make games feel more fluid. It's important to note with the Ally, it is a handheld gaming PC, but if you're expecting high-end PC performance in a handheld, you won't find that here. I don't mean that as a knock against the Ally at all, but I've had multiple readers message me about how they were expecting the Steam Deck to be a full-on PC gaming experience, when it's just not. So keep your expectations in check, yeah? Now that I've said that, I need to quickly contradict myself. For most, the ASUS ROG Ally will be the most powerful gaming handheld they've played, but it won't rival their gaming PC. I'm emphasising here for most, and you'll see why. You see, it's possible to hook up what's known as an XG Mobile to the Ally. Think of the XG Mobile as basically a graphics card with its own proprietary dock that you can plug into specific ASUS devices. Alongside testing out the Ally, I've also been using the XG Mobile RTX 4090, and when I tell you I screamed, I screamed. One of the Ally reveals that always threw me was the use of the Ryzen Z1 Extreme. That's a really advanced processor for a device that doesn't really need it. It's a handheld after all. It turns out the inclusion of the Ryzen Z1 Extreme is so you can literally turn the ASUS ROG Ally into a high-end gaming PC. How high-end are we talking? I managed to run Cyberpunk 2077 at 45 frames with the settings maxed out and the fancy new ray tracing and path tracing turned on. Something most high-end PCs struggle with. Diablo 4 sailed to a constant 60 frames per second with everything as high as it'll go, and that's not even with the Ally in its 30 watt mode. Want to play Skyrim with a sickening amount of visual mods? The Ally with the XG Mobile RTX 4090 runs it at 1080p at 60 frames, even with all the mod installs, and it's like it was opening Notepad. That's how quick it was. Of course, not everyone will want to go down this route. It's ridiculously expensive for a start. But, on the flip side, there's no denying just how transformative it is. It turns the Ally from a powerful handheld into a high-end gaming PC at the push of a plug. Okay, let's talk about the operating system for a bit. The ASUS ROG Ally shipping with Windows 11 is a smart decision. Having native apps means everything can be installed and it'll just work. There will be a level of incompatibility here and there, but that's standard and expected when you run Windows on a handheld device. Windows is, after all, designed for PCs, not handhelds. Here comes the but. Windows 11 isn't as smooth sailing as you'd expect. While SteamOS and the Steam Deck is intuitive and does what it needs well, Windows 11 is still in need of some taming, and the problems with Windows 11 are even more apparent on the ROG Ally. Not having a dedicated guide button like you'd find on Xbox or PlayStation means you'll need to manually map it to a button yourself. The Steam app, even now, still refuses to work with the input mode when it's set to gamepad or auto. To use the Ally's controls, you'll need to invoke a menu, then switch to desktop mode, and then you can access Steam and move the cursor about and everything. It's a minor gripe, I know, but it's also kind of frustrating. ASUS's Armory Crate is a solid addition for changing settings and launching games, but it just doesn't go deep enough. It's basic compared to what SteamOS is capable of. Then there's docked mode, which requires multiple changes to get working. The resolution switch command in the Ally works for most of the time, but you end up with a 1080p display inside of a smaller 720p window. This has mostly been fixed since launch, but it still happens occasionally, especially if you're trying to run something at 4K. Then there's trying to get a DualSense controller to work. It won't work natively unless you're using it through Steam. I ended up needing to grab the DS4 Windows app and set up 2 profiles because I can't manually summon the Ally's menu on a controller. Those profiles being one for desktop, one for gaming. All of these issues are problems that can be solved if you know what you're doing, but they're problems that either don't exist or are less of an issue on the Steam Deck. Of course, Valve has had a head start and a full year to iron out these problems, but it's worth something keeping in mind if you're just about to pick up an Ally. Expect frustration until ASUS finally fixes things. I should add, I've managed to fix most of the problems myself through the use of third-party apps. Not everyone will have that level of knowledge or know what kind of apps they're looking for to fix the problems, so I'm hoping ASUS finally does get around to fixing all the issues that it has. I'd also like to talk about 1080p gaming a bit. The ROG Ally can play games at 1080p at 120Hz, but most of those newer AAA games are going to need to be locked to 720p, otherwise they simply won't run. Older games, mainly retro stuff, can hit the 1080p target but likely won't support 120 frames per second. Obviously, I'd rather have 1080p resolution at 120Hz than not, but don't expect to get much usage out of it if you're picking up the Ally to play current AAA games. For older stuff in emulation, however, it's a boon. Okay, let's talk about the elephant. The ROG Ally doesn't feature touchpads like the Steam Deck. That means instead of using a pad to control the mouse cursor and click, you need to rely on the right joystick to move the mouse and the right bumper to click. You'll also instantly want to remap that function to the right trigger for ease. How does this work in practice? It's fine. Honestly, it's fine. I've seen a couple of people bemoan the lack of trackpads, and while they are easier to use, using stick isn't that difficult. Once you've adjusted the cursor speed to your liking and remapped the buttons to something more intuitive, it works. Not as well, but it works and does the job. This, for me, isn't a deal breaker, and there's a lot of fuss over nothing. People have been controlling Windows with a controller for decades. It's something most will easily adapt to. Moving on to the design, the trigger to back button ratio feels natural, and the lighter device is easier to hold than the Steam Deck. I'm not a fan of how the bumpers are pressed and how they flow directly into the shape of the triggers, but it's a minor gripe and one I can deal with. The fans, meanwhile, are whisper quiet at 9 watts and 15 watts. At 25 and 30 watts you'll hear them, but even then it's more manageable than the Steam Deck. Although, I should point out, ever since there was an overheating problem, the fans have been cranked up to try and compensate for this. This ends with the fans sounding louder than they actually should be. This will be adjusted later down the line though. Battery life is a bit of a sticking point. On one hand, the Steam Deck has a poor battery life. On the other, the ROG Ally's is even worse at 25 watts in handheld mode. They both share the same battery capacity of 40 watt hours. That means at 40 watts the Ally would last about an hour, at 20 watts 2 hours, at 10 watts 4 hours, and so on. The problem we have is that to include a larger battery, and 40 watt hours is large, would raise the cost even further. It's a problem neither Valve or ASUS has managed to solve. For gaming outside, the problem limits, but if you're indoors near a plug socket or you're playing in docked mode, it's less of a burden. The biggest compliment I have for the ROG Ally is that after my review period, I went out and bought one myself. Despite the irritations with the operating system, the sheer power of the Ally carries it. It's closer to the Steam Deck dream of having a high-powered handheld that can play anything and play to a satisfactory standard. We do, however, need to talk about some of the problems that have arisen with the ROG Ally. The first one is overheating. Your memory card slot may die. There's no logic to this, we're still waiting on a fix, and even mine has died eventually. Some people have reported their memory cards were fried in this problem, but mine managed to survive. There was also problems with the joystick dead zone, but ASUS has since fixed this. Overall, the ROG Ally is in perfect and dire need of tweaks, but when it comes to gaming, the ROG Ally is the handheld to beat. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like, and if you'd like to subscribe, that'd be great. Until next time, see ya.